17 male slaves went missing from the household records of Richmond's most important families between March and November of 1849. Official records say they were sold to faraway plantations, but shipping manifests don't show any signs of these transfers. The city's books hid things that were much worse than just mistakes in the books. 8 women from Virginia's oldest families had made a deal in the parlors of Church Hill's grandest mansions, behind locked doors covered in imported French wallpaper. If the deal were to be found out, the Virginia legislature would have to hold an emergency session. The men were never sold and never left Richmond. For more than 70 years, Virginia's most closely guarded secret would be what these women did with them. Richmond was at the height of its pre-Civil War prosperity in the spring of 1849. The number of people living in the city had grown to almost 28,000. Its tobacco warehouses lined the James River like monuments to King Cotton's smaller, more fragrant cousin. Church Hill was higher than the business district. It was a neighborhood of columned mansions where Virginia's oldest families lived. These weren't the new rich from the cotton trade. They were the descendants of colonial gentry whose families had been in Virginia soil before the Revolution. The women who came to these homes on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons acted like the most refined women in the South. They set up charity drives for the poor, brought flowers to St. John's Episcopal Church, and kept up the complicated social rules that set Virginia's upper class apart from the rest of the rich. Their husbands were lawyers, ran tobacco businesses, and were in the state legislature. Their daughters learned how to play the piano and speak French, and their sons went to the College of William and Mary. Catherine Harrove was in charge of this social circle with the quiet power of old money. She was 43 when her father died and left her the Harrove tobacco fortune. She managed it in a way that shocked the men in Richmond's business community. Thomas Hargrove, her husband, was a circuit court judge who spent a lot of time traveling to Virginia's western counties. The Hargrove Mansion on Franklin Street had 12 rooms, a music room, and space for 23 slaves to live. Elalina Randolph was one of Catherine's closest friends. She was a distant cousin of the president's family, and her husband owned a controlling interest in 3 tobacco warehouses. Then there was Margaret Wickham, who came from one of the founding families of Jamestown. She owned 2 homes in Church Hill and a 1,000-acre plantation in Charles City County. Lucinda Epps had married into a wealthy banking family, but her family tree went back 200 years before the marriage. Since 1650, her family tree has been linked to every important family in Virginia. These women had a better understanding of power than their husbands did. Men had power through the law and business, but Southern women of their class had power in more subtle ways. They ran homes with dozens of enslaved people, settled disagreements, handed out punishments, and made decisions every day that affected many lives. They were absolute rulers in their own homes. But by early 1849, the careful balance of Church Hill society had changed. People who paid close attention might have noticed that Catherine Harrove's Tuesday afternoon salons were becoming less open to everyone. The number of women on the guest list went down from 20 to 8. The same male servants always came to these events. The parlor doors remained locked during these meetings, unusual in an era when proper ladies kept doors open to preserve reputation. People in Richmond's black community saw more. House servants whispered about strange requests, like men being called to mansions where they didn't have any regular duties. People in Shockoe Bottom talked about how husbands and sons would go into Church Hill homes and come back different, quiet, and with their eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, as if they were afraid to meet a direct gaze. Samuel, who was 31 years old and a slave of the Harrove family, had been Catherine's personal servant since her father's death. He was 6 feet tall and had the posture of someone who had been treated better than most slaves. This was because he had been taught to read, even though Virginia law said this was illegal. He grew up in the Harrove house, where his mother worked as Catherine's nurse when she was a child. This closeness had made their relationship more complicated than just ownership. Catherine had started to explore this dynamic in ways that went against all the rules of her society. Catherine called Samuel to her private sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. This was a room her husband didn't often go into. What happened in that room over the next few hours would set off a chain reaction that would spread through the rich homes of Church Hill like a fever through a crowded tenement. The weather was strange for early spring on the afternoon of the 6th of March, 1849. A warm front from the Carolinas had moved up, bringing temperatures into the low 72s and making Richmond feel more like June. Catherine had fired all the servants in the Harrove mansion except for Samuel. She had them run errands that would keep them busy for hours. She had locked the door to her sitting room from the inside and drawn the curtains, even though the weather was nice. Catherine's detailed journals, which kept track of every social call and household expense, never mentioned what happened in that room. Later, Samuel would tell his wife Dinah, who worked for the Randolphs, that Mrs. Hargrove had called him in to help her move furniture. Instead, she told him to sit down, which was against all the rules of their relationship. She had given him tea, which was also impossible in the strict hierarchy of a slave state. Then she started talking about how lonely she was, how her husband was always gone, and how strange it was for a woman to be married to duty instead of companionship. At first, her words were a confession, but then they turned into something more dangerous. She had touched his hand and asked him questions about his thoughts and feelings, treating him like something other than property for those strange hours. And then she asked for something that changed the very foundation of their world. Samuel left that room 3 hours later with orders not to tell anyone. He knew that there was no way to resist, and he knew that Tuesday afternoons would now follow this strange new pattern. Catherine came out with rosy cheeks and sparkling eyes, which her returning servant said were because of the unusual warmth. Catherine told Elalana Randolph about her problems during a morning visit a week later. The two women had been friends since they were kids. Their families had been connected through marriages and business deals for generations. Whatever Catherine said in that conversation, Elalana was not horrified. She was interested. She asked questions, did the math, and even thought out loud about whether her own home could work in the same way. 2 weeks after Catherine's first offense, Elalana called Dinah's husband Isaac to her private chambers, saying she needed to fix a loose window latch. There was no need to fix the window. By April, 6 more women from Churchill's closest circle had started doing it. The women started meeting regularly, supposedly for their work with the Richmond Female Orphan Asylum, but their talks had changed. They talked in code about their plans, comparing methods, and talking about how to get things done. Margaret Wickham said she had started switching between 3 of the men who worked for her at home. Lucinda Epps said she liked men in their late 22s better than older slaves because they were more energetic and disciplined than younger slaves. What started out as a private sin for Catherine turned into something more organized and systematic. The women made plans and shared their enslaved men between homes, making a schedule that changed every few days to lower the chance of being found out. If a servant was called to one mistress's private rooms too often, people might start to wonder. But if he had to run errands between homes, and his absences could be explained by real work, it was harder to see the pattern. By May 1849, the 8 women had formed what they called the Sisterhood of Charity, which was meant to be ironic. The name served 2 purposes. It was a cover story for their charitable work, and it made fun of the idea of Christian virtue that they said they embodied. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, they got together at each other's houses. The meetings started with real charitable work, like writing letters to the orphanage or making plans for church social events. This made records of real activity. But once this front was set up, the real reason for their meetings began. The women had come up with a way to keep things so secret that it would have impressed Richmond's military planners. Each woman had 2 sets of household ledgers, one for her husband to look at that showed normal expenses and activities, and another hidden ledger that kept track of the real schedule of their plans. They used trusted female house slaves as lookouts and put them in key places to watch for husbands coming back unexpectedly or surprise visitors. They made up hand signals and secret phrases. "We will need more linen" meant that the meeting was set. "The roses need attention" meant that the event was canceled because it was too risky. The men they called had to take part. Samuel, Isaac, and the others were in a lot of mental pain. They were being used in ways that hurt them just as much as violence, but they couldn't say no without risking punishment or being sold. Some had wives, kids, and families who would be hurt if they didn't do what they were told or told what was going on. They were stuck in a nightmare that their mistress had made for them, forced to take part in their own abuse while staying completely quiet. As spring turned into summer, the arrangement started to show cracks in its carefully built facade. The first sign came from an unexpected source: the enslaved women of Church Hill. Dinah had seen her husband change over the course of those months. Isaac had always been strong and proud, even though he was in chains. He kept his dignity by making small acts of resistance and refusing to do things quietly. But when Elena Randolph started calling him to her private rooms, something inside him broke. He stopped looking Dinah in the eye. When she touched him, he flinched. He lay still next to her at night, and she could hear him breathing as if he were swallowing screams. Others also saw these changes. In the kitchens and laundry rooms of Church Hill, enslaved women got information like soldiers on a mission. They talked about which men were being called, how often, and for what reasons. They saw that these men were always the youngest, strongest, and most attractive. After these private meetings, they noticed that their mistresses' faces were flushed and that they looked very happy. The women knew what was going on long before any white person in Richmond did. They had to make a choice: tell the truth about the abuse and risk having their families torn apart through sale and punishment, or stay quiet and watch their husbands, brothers, and sons be used in ways that hurt everyone involved. Rachel, who was a slave to Margaret Wickham, chose to do something. She was 53 years old and had raised Margaret from birth. She had the strange power that some enslaved women who had nursed their owners as babies had. In early June, she went right up to Margaret and talked to her, picking a time when they were alone in the breakfast room. "Miss Margaret," Rachel said, her voice steady even though she was taking a huge risk, "I need to be honest with you about what's been going on in this house." Margaret carefully put down her teacup. "You forget who you are, Rachel." "No, ma'am. I'm remembering that I raised you, and that I've been loyal to this family for 37 years. I'm telling you that what you and those other women are doing is going to bring ruin down on all of us." It was almost a minute before anyone said anything. At first, Margaret's face turned pale, and then it turned bright red. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with rage and fear. "Do you understand me? You will never tell anyone about this again." Rachel said, "I know that sin will always come to light, no matter how deep you bury it. I know that you can't do this to these men without ruining everything it touches." Margaret stood up suddenly, and her chair scraped against the wood floor. "Get out, and if you care about your daughter's safety, don't ever bring this up again." The threat was clear. Rachel's daughter, who was only 14 years old, worked in the kitchen at Wickham. Margaret was telling Rachel how easy it would be to sell that daughter to the South and send her to the cotton fields, where people rarely lived more than 10 years. Rachel walked out of the breakfast room with her head held high, but Margaret's warning worked. Rachel wouldn't talk about it again, at least not to anyone who was white. But she did talk to the other women, and they all started to make plans. If they couldn't stop the abuse directly, maybe they could cause enough trouble to make it too dangerous to keep going. The 8 households started to have problems with small acts of sabotage. Linens went missing, meals were too salty, and messages didn't get delivered. Nothing so bad that it needed harsh punishment, but enough to cause problems and make these homes less reliable. The sisterhood saw these problems, but they didn't understand them. They thought that the people they had enslaved were just getting lazy and too comfortable in their jobs. This way of thinking made them more disciplined, which only made them more angry and made their careful campaign of resistance bigger. By July, a new threat had come from an unexpected place. Thomas Hargrove, Catherine's husband, came home early from his circuit court travels because a case had been put off. He got home on a Tuesday afternoon, right when Catherine's salon was open. It was very strange for a party that the front door was locked from the inside. He could hear women's voices in the parlor, but he could also hear something else that didn't sound like work for a charitable committee. Thomas came in through the kitchen door, which scared the servants because they had been told not to let anyone in during these meetings. Before they could warn their mistress, he had walked through the house and reached the parlor door. "It was locked from the inside," said a woman's voice, which was followed by a deeper voice that was definitely male. "Open this door, Catherine," he called, banging on it hard. The talk came to an end all of a sudden. There was silence for about 30 seconds, then footsteps and the sound of the key turning. Catherine opened the door, and her face was perfectly calm. But Thomas noticed that her hair was a little messy and her eyes were bright, which made him think she was upset. "Thomas, you're home early." How strange. Her voice was light, but he could hear the hint of worry in it. He looked past her into the living room. Samuel was standing by the window, looking very uncomfortable. There were 5 other women there, all from the highest levels of Richmond society. There didn't seem to be any reason for a male slave to be at a meeting for ladies' charity. Thomas asked, "What is he doing here?" as he looked at Samuel. "He was moving a desk for us," Catherine said, "without any problems. We had to move the furniture around because the light in the afternoon had changed. Samuel was just leaving." It made sense, but Thomas was still bothered by something about the scene. The women's faces didn't show the relaxed comfort of socializing. Instead, they showed an interest he couldn't quite put his finger on. Samuel's face was carefully blank, but his body language showed shame instead of the calm demeanor that a servant should have when doing a simple task. Thomas nodded and let it go, but he started to pay more attention to his wife over the next few days. He saw things he hadn't seen before, like the locked doors, the specific servants who were there during her salons, and her insistence on complete privacy during these events. He didn't say anything, but his interest had been piqued, and once it would be hard to fool him. By the end of July, the summer heat had settled over Richmond with a heavy weight, making the city feel like a slow-cooking pot of humidity and stress. Even though there were more and more warning signs around them, the 8 women of the sisterhood became bolder. Maybe it was the thrill of breaking the rules that had been in place since birth that made them want to do it again and again. Maybe it was just that they hadn't faced any consequences in a long time and had started to think they were untouchable. By August, Catherine had added 2 more men to her rotation. They were both from her country property, and she had moved them to Richmond under the pretense of needing more help around the house. In addition to the afternoon salons, she had also started hosting evening get-togethers, small dinners where the wine flowed freely and the guests talked more openly about their plans. The women had started to think of their systematic abuse as an open secret among themselves, and they talked about it with the same casualness that other women might use when talking about new dress patterns or how well their gardens were doing. Ella Lenina Randolph had started writing down what they did in a secret journal using a code she learned from her father. Each woman got a letter, and each man got a number. Dates and short notes about how satisfied people were kept for each encounter. She kept this journal in a locked drawer of her writing desk, sure that the code made it impossible for anyone who found it to read it. Eleanor didn't know that Isaac, the man she called most often, could read. Ella Lenina's father had taught him years before, when some slaveholders still thought that education might make their slaves more valuable. Isaac had seen Ella Lenina writing in her journal and knew where she kept the key. Isaac carefully picked the lock on Ella Lenina's desk late one night in August while she and her husband were sleeping. He used a wire from a broken corset stay. He couldn't break the code right away, but he carefully copied a few pages onto paper he had stolen from the kitchen accounts ledger. He put these copies in the cellar, wrapped them in oilcloth, and buried them under a loose stone. He wasn't sure what he would do with this proof, but he knew that having proof was powerful, even for someone who didn't have the legal right to have power. Isaac told Samuel about his discovery, and together they came up with an idea that had never been done before. A way to expose their mistresses that wouldn't get them killed. They needed a white friend who had the power to act and the moral courage to do so. They found him in a place they didn't expect. Reverend William Thompson had been the pastor at St. John's Episcopal Church for 11 years. He was respected, but not loved, at 62. He was known for sermons that focused on duty and judgment instead of comfort and grace. He also spoke out more than most people about his belief that slavery, while maybe necessary, was not inherently good and came with moral obligations that most slaveholders ignored. The elite of Church Hill didn't like him for this reason, but his social status and education kept them from directly criticizing him. Celia, Samuel's mother, cleaned the church. She had known Reverend Thompson since he moved to Richmond and had talked to him about faith and morality from time to time. At the end of August, Samuel asked his mother to set up a private meeting with the Reverend because he said he needed spiritual advice about something that was bothering him. The meeting took place in the church's small library on a night when there were no services planned. Samuel had never been so scared before. He was about to say that some of Richmond's most powerful women had done something very wrong morally. If Thompson didn't believe him, or worse, if Thompson did believe him but chose to protect the women instead of getting justice, Samuel would probably be sold to the South before the week was over. But Samuel had made the right choice about his man. He carefully chose his words to describe what was happening without going into too much detail about the abuse. As he spoke, Thompson's face changed from doubt to horror to cold rage. The Reverend sat in silence for a few minutes after Samuel finished speaking. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "These are serious charges," Thompson finally said. "Yes, I know, but there is proof, sir. Mrs. Randolph has written proof, and there are witnesses who could be persuaded to talk. Every enslaved person in those 8 households knows what has been going on." Thompson stood up and walked to the window where he could see the mansions of Church Hill against the evening sky. "Do you know what you're asking me to do? To accuse these women would be to shake Richmond society to its core. I would be going up against some of the most powerful families in Virginia." "I understand, sir. I also understand that what they are doing is wrong, and that evil grows when good men choose comfort over truth." The minister turned around to look at Samuel again, and there was something fierce and unyielding in his eyes. "I need proof in writing. Can you get it without getting caught?" "Yes, sir. I think I can." "Then do it. Bring it to me here in 3 days. And Samuel," Thompson paused, "I want you to know that I believe you, and I will act on this no matter what it costs me. Some sins are too deep to ignore." The next 3 days were full of tension. Isaac and Samuel waited for a night when the Randolphs were having a dinner party. Elena would be busy for hours and wouldn't be able to check her private rooms. As guests arrived and servants hurried to do their jobs on the evening of September 1st, Isaac slipped upstairs. He shook his hands as he picked the lock on the desk again. Elena had put the journal exactly where it was. He carefully took it off and wrapped it in a kitchen towel he had brought for this reason. He put a book of the same size and weight in the drawer so that Eleanor would feel the right amount of resistance and weight when she opened it. Then he went down the servants' stairs and gave the journal to Samuel, who was in the garden. Samuel ran through the streets of the city at night to get to St. John's Church. They found Reverend Thompson in the library, and they sat together under a lamp and started to figure out Eleanor's code. It was easier than Eleanor thought it would be. It was a simple substitution code that could be broken down with some time and effort. In 2 hours, they had translated enough pages to back up everything Samuel had said. The journal entries were clear and very bad. Eleanor had written down names, dates, and other information with the same care as someone who wasn't afraid of being found out. She had even given each man a score, a number that showed how well he did. Thompson's face got more and more stiff with disgust as he read these pages. "That's enough," he finally said. "More than enough. I will take this to Bishop Meade tomorrow. He will have to call a church meeting, and from there, this will go to the police." Samuel asked, "What will happen to us? To the men who were treated this way?" Thompson looked at him with real sadness. "I don't know. I wish I could promise you safety. But the truth is that Virginia law sees you as property, not victims. The women will lose their social standing and maybe even go to jail. But you will have to deal with the consequences of your master's choices. It's very unfair, but that's how the world is. We know the risk, sir. But this has to stop, not just for us, but for anyone else who might have to go through this in the future." Thompson nodded slowly. "Put the journal back where you found it. Don't let them know what's coming. Can you do that without getting caught?" "I'll give it a shot, sir." Samuel ran back to the house, where the dinner party was still going on. He gave the journal back to Isaac, who had been getting more and more worried while he waited. Isaac went back up the stairs, put the journal back in the desk, and locked the drawer again. The theft only lasted a little less than 3 hours, and as far as anyone in the house knew, nothing strange had happened. The next morning, though, Reverend Thompson went to the home of Bishop William Meade, the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia and one of the state's most powerful religious leaders. Thompson brought with him detailed notes from Ella Lenena's journal that included exact dates, names, and descriptions that could not be dismissed as slander or confusion. Bishop Meade had been a bishop for 18 years. He was 73 years old, serious, and very conservative in his social views. He thought that God had planned for slavery to bring Christian civilization to a lower race. Most white Virginians of his class agreed with this view. He also thought that owning slaves came with a lot of moral responsibility, and that slaveholders who abused their power would be judged by God. As Thompson went through the evidence, Bishop Meade's face went through stages of disbelief, shock, and anger. The bishop sat quietly for a few minutes after Thompson was done. His shoulders drooped and his breathing became heavy, making it clear how old he was. He finally said, "If this is true, it is a moral corruption so deep that I can hardly understand it. These are women I have known for decades, women who sit in my church every Sunday and claim to be good Christians. Yes, Your Grace, I have seen the written proof and talked to witnesses. Then we have to do something. But William, do you know what this will cause? It's not just a matter of individual sin. It will show that the very women we trust to raise children, keep the peace, and uphold moral standards are capable of great evil. I understand, but the alternative is to allow this to continue, to become complicit through our silence." Bishop Meade got up and walked to his window to look out at the morning light on the streets of Richmond. "Hold a private inquiry. Choose 5 men of unquestionable character who are not related to the women accused. I will lead the inquiry myself. We will hear the evidence, talk to the witnesses, and find out what really happened. If the accusations are true, we will give our findings to the civil authorities. May God have mercy on us all." The investigation began in complete secrecy on September 10th in a private room at St. John's Church. Bishop Meade picked 5 men who were all respected leaders in the community, but they weren't from the innermost circle of Church Hill. There was a merchant, a doctor, a lawyer, a plantation owner from Henrico County, and a professor from Hampton-Sydney College among them. Everyone had taken an oath of secrecy and knew that they were looking into very sensitive issues. Reverend Thompson started the investigation by giving his evidence and explaining how he found out about it. The panel members were more and more shocked as he talked about the system the 8 women had set up. Then he read aloud parts of his transcriptions of Ella Lenena's journal. The entries were so clear that there was no doubt about what had happened. The next step was the witnesses. Samuel was the first to testify. He used careful, restrained language to explain what Catherine Harrove had done to him. Several members of the panel were visibly moved by his dignity in the face of such a violation. Isaac came next and backed up Samuel's story, adding more information about Ella Randolph's actions. 3 more enslaved men gave testimony, and each one talked about similar patterns of abuse and coercion. Rachel, Margaret Wickham's enslaved nurse, was next. She talked about how she confronted Margaret and how Margaret had threatened Rachel's daughter. Her testimony showed that at least some of the women knew their actions were wrong and were trying to hide them. The last witness was a surprise. Dr. Henry Garrett, a Richmond doctor who worked with some of Church Hill's most important families. He said that in July he had been called to look at Ella Lenena Randolph after she complained of female troubles. During the exam, he found signs that she had been having sex a lot, which was strange for a woman whose husband had been away on business for the previous month. He had noticed this strange thing at the time, but hadn't said anything about it, thinking it was probably an affair with someone from her own class. Now, because of the other evidence, the importance of his findings became clear. The investigation came to an end late that night. The panel talked about it for less than an hour before deciding that the accusations were true and backed up by strong evidence. Bishop Meade told the governor of Virginia to get a formal report and a recommendation that all 8 women be charged with crimes. On September 11, the next day, Bishop Meade went to the state capitol and gave the governor the results of the investigation in person. Floyd read the report in silence, and his face got redder and redder. When he was done, he looked up at the bishop with eyes that were almost full of despair. "Do you know what you're giving me? If this gets out, it will ruin some of Virginia's most powerful families. It will make it look like our whole society is based on lies and perversion." "I get it, Governor. I also know that justice requires action, no matter what the social consequences are. Floyd got up and walked to his window, just like Bishop Meade had done at his own house. Richmond went about its normal business outside, not knowing that its foundations were about to change. I'll have to get the state legislature involved. This is too big for just the executive branch to handle. We'll need to hold an emergency session. When? Give me 3 days to get things ready. Some of the lawmakers are friends or family of the women who are accused. I need to talk to some important people in private before this goes to the full assembly. And what if the women are arrested? Floyd shook his head slowly. Not yet. If we arrest them now, before the legislature has decided what to do, we could face legal problems that could ruin the whole case, but I will keep an eye on them discreetly. If they try to leave Richmond, we will arrest them right away. That same afternoon, Floyd called on Robert Stannard, his most trusted aide and a lawyer who had worked for 3 governors and was known for his moral clarity and discretion. Floyd gave him the inquiry report and watched as Stannard read it, his face going from curious to disgusted. "Dear God," Stannard said quietly when he was done. "How long has this been going on?" "Since March, as far as we can tell. In some cases, it may have been longer. I need you to do some initial legal research. What charges can we bring under Virginia law? What precedents are there? And most importantly, how do we move forward without making a public spectacle that hurts Virginia's reputation across the country?" Stannard spent the next 2 days in the state law library, going over case records and laws. What he found was both good and bad. Virginia law made it very clear that adultery and fornication were against the law. People who did these things could be whipped in public or fined. There were a few cases in the 18th century where white women were found guilty of having sex with enslaved men, but these were usually poor women who didn't have a lot of social standing. But Stannard couldn't find any cases in Virginia's legal history that were even close to this one. Wealthy, socially prominent women systematically taking advantage of multiple enslaved men over a long period of time. The most similar case was one from 1762 inches Williamsburg that involved the wife of a tavern owner. She was quickly found guilty and whipped in public. It seemed both legally right and politically impossible to punish women from Virginia's oldest families the same way. On the night of September 13, Stannard told Floyd what he had found. He said, "The law is clear that what they did was a crime, but enforcing that law in this case is very hard. These women have strong family ties all over Virginia. Several legislators are their cousins or brothers-in-law. If we go through the normal legal process, we'll run into problems at every step. What do you think? An extraordinary measure. Call an emergency session of the legislature. Show them the evidence, and let them decide what to do next. This takes the decision out of your hands and spreads the responsibility across the whole General Assembly. Whatever they decide will be based on the judgment of the whole group, not just the executive." Floyd slowly nodded. "Then what if they decide to protect these women instead of doing what's right? Then we will have learned something terrible about Virginia's moral character. But I don't think that will happen. The evidence is too strong, and the men in that chamber still believe in honor and law, even if they don't always follow them." Governor Floyd held a number of private meetings with legislative leaders over the next 2 days. He first met with James Barber, the Speaker of the House. Barber is known for being honest, even though he owned slaves. Barber read the report in Floyd's office, and with each page, his face got darker. Barber said, "This is an abomination," when he was done. "These women have broken every rule of Christian civilization. They have brought shame on Virginia, ruined their own homes, and brought shame on Virginia. Will you support an emergency session?" "I will. And I will support whatever punishment the Assembly thinks is fair, no matter who these women's families are." Floyd then met with important senators, committee chairmen, and leaders of different legislative groups. Everyone was shocked by the response, but some were more worried about the scandal than about justice. Senator William Rives, whose wife was distantly related to Ella Randolph, strongly argued for keeping the matter quiet, maybe through civil proceedings that would keep it out of the public eye. Rives said, "If this gets out, it will give every abolitionist newspaper in the North more fuel for their fire. They will use this to say that slavery corrupts everyone it touches and that Southern society is morally bankrupt. We need to think about Virginia's reputation. Floyd's answer was harsh. Senator, Virginia's reputation isn't based on hiding evil. It's based on dealing with it when we find it. Would you have us protect these women just because it might be inconvenient to do so? By the night of September 13th, Floyd had enough support to call the emergency meeting. He wrote the official summons, saying that there were urgent moral and legal issues that needed the attention of the legislature right away. The meeting would take place the next morning at 9, and all members of both houses had to be there. In Church Hill, on the other hand, the 8 women had started to feel like something was very wrong. Catherine Harrove saw strange men watching her house. They didn't try to get close, but they seemed to be keeping track of everyone who came and went. When she sent Samuel to the market to ask about household supplies, he came back with news that other men were nearby the homes of the other women. Catherine quickly called an emergency meeting of the sisterhood and sent coded messages to her most trusted servants. That night, the women met at Margaret Wickham's house. They were usually confident, but this time they were nervous. "Someone is watching us," Catherine said without any introduction. "Someone knows. All of us." Elena Randolph turned pale. "That's not possible. We've been so careful. No one outside of our group knows about our plan." "Someone knows. The question is who and what they plan to do with that information." Suddenly, Lucinda Epps stood up, her hand shaking. "We should leave Richmond tonight, before whatever is coming gets here." "And where do you want to go?" Margaret asked. "If we run away, we will be guilty. We have to stay and stand together. No matter what accusations are made, we will deny them completely. It's our word against the word of slaves, and Virginia law is clear about whose testimony matters." Catherine wasn't so sure. Virginia law is also clear about adultery. If someone has actual evidence, not just testimony, our social standing may not protect us. "What proof could they possibly have?" Elena asked. "We haven't left any written records or any kind of documentation." As she said this, she felt a chill in her stomach and suddenly doubted the safety of her coded journal. The women argued all night, but they couldn't agree on anything. Some wanted to run away. Others wanted to stay and fight. And still others wanted to ask their powerful family members for help. They said goodbye around midnight and planned to meet up again the next day, not knowing that their fates would be sealed by then. The emergency legislative session met behind closed doors on September 14th. Only members of the General Assembly were allowed to be there. No reporters or members of the public were allowed. Governor Floyd stood at the front of the room and waited for everyone to be quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of deep regret. "Men, I have called you here today to talk about something that is so morally important that I can hardly find the words to describe it. What I am about to show you will shock you, offend your sensibilities, and make you question what you think you know about the society we have built here in Virginia. But I ask you to listen with open minds and remember that justice, no matter how painful, must always be our guiding principle." He then gave out copies of the inquiry report to important lawmakers and read parts of it out loud. The room went quiet in shock as the full extent of the scandal became clear. After Floyd was done, he let people ask questions and talk about what he had said. The first person to speak was Senator Thomas Ritchie, who was 72 years old and had known some of the accused women since they were children. His voice shook with feeling. "Governor Floyd, these women are the daughters of Virginia's most respected families. I have known them for decades. Are we sure of these accusations?" "The proof is overwhelming, Senator. There are written records, testimonies from multiple witnesses, and even medical evidence." The inquiry panel was made up of 5 men of unquestionable character who carefully looked over everything. Their conclusion was unanimous. Next up was Delegate John Minor. "What about the enslaved men who testified? How do we know they are telling the truth? Could they have reasons to lie about their mistresses?" Floyd had thought about this question. What could have motivated them? Coming forward put them in a lot of danger. They could have been sold, separated from their families, or worse. They got nothing from this testimony except the chance that the abuse might stop. The argument went on for hours and got more and more heated. Men stood up and yelled at the women in a way that sounded like they were angry from the Bible. Some people defended them, saying that the real bad guys were the enslaved men who had somehow seduced their mistresses. Several lawmakers who were related to the women who were accused stepped down from the case, their faces gray with shame and anger. Delegate Samuel McDowell gave what was probably the most powerful speech of the session. He was only 34 years old, but he was known for being smart about the law and having strong morals. He got up in the middle of the debate and spoke without notes. His voice was clear and strong. Men, I understand the urge to protect these women. They are our neighbors, family members, and women we have been taught to see as models of virtue. But that is exactly why this is such a serious matter. These women didn't just cheat on their husbands. They systematically exploited people over whom they had complete control. They used slavery itself as a way to get what they wanted, breaking both God's and Virginia's laws. Some here have suggested that the enslaved men somehow seduced these women. I would ask those colleagues to consider the nature of power in these relationships. How does a man who can be whipped or sold for disobedience seduce the woman who holds his fate in her hands? This was not seduction. This was coercion, pure and simple. And the women wielded that coercion. We are often told that slavery is a civilizing institution, that it brings Christianity and order to an inferior race. How can we maintain that argument while simultaneously arguing that enslaved men corrupted their pure white mistresses? Either these men are inferior and incapable of such corruption, or they are equal to us in their capacity for moral agency. We cannot have it both ways. I propose that we face this matter with the honesty it demands. These women committed grave crimes. They violated their marriage vows, they corrupted their households, and they brought disgrace upon Virginia. The law provides remedies for such crimes, and we must apply those remedies regardless of the social status of the offenders. To do otherwise is to admit that we have one law for the powerful and another for everyone else. The tone of the debate changed after McDowell's speech. Some lawmakers who had been unsure now spoke out in favor of prosecution. But the question was still, what kind of prosecution should it be? The Assembly talked about different options all afternoon and into the night. If someone were charged with adultery, the trials would have to be public, and newspapers all over the country would cover them. Some lawmakers said this was necessary because justice needed full openness. Some people said it would hurt Virginia's reputation forever and give abolitionists a chance to spread their ideas. Senator Benjamin Watkins Lee came up with a third option during the evening session. What if we send them into exile, take their property away from their husbands, and send them away from Virginia for good? This would be fair and keep the scandal to a minimum. The idea sparked a lot of discussion right away. Some saw it as too lenient, allowing wealthy women to escape consequences that poor women would face without question. Some people thought it was fair because it punished the women harshly while keeping Virginia from being embarrassed on a national level. Delegate McDowell stood up again. I see the appeal of this compromise, but I have to ask, are we setting a bad example by letting rich people buy their way out of being charged with a crime? What does that say? Senator Lee gave a thoughtful answer. We're not letting them buy anything. We're taking away their property and sending them away from their home country for good. For women of their class, this is a punishment that may be worse than a public whipping. They lose everything: their homes, their families, their social positions, and even their identities as Virginians. And Virginia doesn't have to put its most famous women on trial for sexual crimes. The argument went on until after midnight, and a vote was finally held around 1 a.m. on September 15th. The measure passed by a small amount. Virginia's adultery laws would have charged the women, but they could choose to be permanently exiled instead of going to trial. If they agreed to exile, they would lose all of their property to their husbands, promise never to go back to Virginia or face jail time, and sign strict non-disclosure agreements that would keep them from talking about the case in public. A second vote was held about the enslaved men who had given testimony. After a long discussion, the Assembly voted to buy them from their owners at a fair market price and give them conditional freedom. They would have to leave Virginia within 30 days, and if they ever came back, they would be enslaved again. It wasn't a perfect solution because it saw the men as both victims and threats to social order that needed to be removed from Virginia. The last vote was about the records themselves. The state archives would keep the inquiry report, the transcripts of the legislative debate, and all other related documents sealed for 75 years. They would not be opened until 1924. This provision passed with a lot of support, even from lawmakers who wanted harsher punishment. They saw the value of keeping the scandal from the public. Before dawn on September 15, officials went to the 8 homes to tell the women what they were being charged with and how long they would be exiled. State deputies, along with lawyers and notaries, gave them official papers that spelled out their choices: go into exile right away and lose their property, or go to court and face criminal charges. At 5:30 inches the morning, Catherine Herove got her notice. She read it carefully, and her face didn't show any emotion. Thomas stood nearby with his own lawyer. When she finished, she looked up at her husband of 19 years. "You knew," she said. "I suspected it wasn't a question. I chose not to see clearly until I couldn't anymore. Will you divorce me? I've already sent in the papers. They will be finished within a month." Catherine nodded slowly. "I guess I should feel ashamed. But I don't. I'm just angry that I lived in a cage for so long without realizing it." "You broke every rule we say we hold dear," Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. "You took men who had no choice and no power to say no to you and used them for your own pleasure. Don't try to dress that up as a rebellion against injustice. And yet you don't think it's unfair that the system gave me complete control over them in the first place? You don't think it's wrong for a society to treat people like property and then be shocked when that property is used in ways you don't like?" Thomas didn't know how to respond. He left the room, and Catherine started to pack her things. She had 24 hours to prepare for permanent exile from the only home she had ever known. Elenina Randolph's answer was much more dramatic. When the officials got to her house, she fell to the ground, crying uncontrollably and saying that Catherine's evil influence had led her astray. Her husband, surprisingly, stayed by her side during her breakdown, his face set in a look of grim determination. He told the officials, "She is my wife. She is still my wife, no matter what she has done. If she has to leave Virginia, I will go with her." Our marriage vows did not say that scandal or disgrace would be an exception. The officials didn't seem to know how to deal with this unexpected loyalty. They told him that he didn't have to go with her and that he could divorce her and keep all of his property and social standing. But he shook his head firmly. "I made promises to God, and I will keep them." Margaret Wickham got very angry and said that as a white woman from a good family, she could not be guilty of such things. "This is a plot by Northern abolitionists," she told the confused officials. "They have forced our slaves to lie in order to hurt Virginia's reputation. I will not accept these accusations as true." "Then you will have to go to court, Mrs. Wickham," the main official said in a calm voice. "The proof against you is strong. I strongly suggest that you accept exile." Margaret's defiance lasted for about 2 hours, until her family lawyer showed up and made it very clear what a public trial would be like. The testimony would be clear and very bad. Every newspaper in the United States would write about her family name. Her scandal would leave a mark on her children and grandchildren. She had signed the papers agreeing to go into exile by noon. Lucinda Epps just stopped talking and went into a catatonic state that her family couldn't wake her from. A doctor was called, and he said that the person had a complete nervous breakdown. She would eventually get well enough to travel, but she would never be able to talk clearly about what happened in September 1849. Her husband divorced her quietly, and she moved in with distant relatives in Pennsylvania who agreed to take her in as long as she never had to be alone with male servants. Over the next week, the 8 women left Richmond at different times and by different routes. The first person to leave was Catherine Herove, who left on September 16. She took a hired carriage to Norfolk, where she got on a steamship to New Orleans. She had 2 trunks of clothes, a small box of jewelry that was legally hers and not her husband's, and $300 in cash. Thomas now owned everything else she had. As her carriage rolled through Richmond's darkened streets, she looked back once at the city of her birth. The mansions on Church Hill stood out against the night sky, their windows lit by lamps. Families ate dinner in rooms where she would never be welcome again. She didn't cry or feel sorry. She just knew what her life had been like and what it could be like in the future. 3 days later, Elenina Randolph and her loyal husband left for Philadelphia, which is to the north. Eleanor asked to see Isaac one last time before she left. The officials turned down this request, saying that she couldn't have any contact with the men who had been involved. She cried when she heard this denial, saying she wanted to apologize and explain that she never meant to hurt anyone. Her husband gently but firmly took her to their carriage. Margaret Wickham and her oldest daughter left for Baltimore. The daughter had agreed to go with her mother into exile, even though it might hurt her own chances of getting married. In the same way, the other women left. Some went alone, while others went with family members who chose loyalty over reputation. By September 23rd, all 8 had left Virginia. The Churchill Society then began the painful process of forgetting them. On September 20, Samuel, Isaac, and the other men who had testified got their papers saying they could go free. The letter was short, written on official state stationery, and signed by Governor Floyd himself. It said that the Commonwealth of Virginia had freed them as payment for their testimony in a matter of state importance, and that they had to leave Virginia by October 20th. Samuel read his papers 3 times because he couldn't believe what they meant. Freedom. He had heard the word all his life, but never thought he would have to use it. But it was freedom with very strict limits. He could never go back to Virginia or see his mother's grave after she died. He could never walk the streets of the only city he had ever known. He got his wife and mother together and told them what had happened. He showed them the papers with hands that shook a little. Celia, his mother, cried quietly. She was 61 years old and had been a slave her whole life. The thought of being free at her age was both exciting and scary. His wife asked, "Where are we going?" "North, maybe Philadelphia. Somewhere with a lot of free black people, where we can find work and start a new life." And what do we say to people? How do we tell them how we got free? Samuel looked at the papers that showed he was free again. We tell them the truth. We testified in a court case, and Virginia let us go. We don't need to say what we testified about. Samuel went back to St. John's Church one last time before he left Richmond. Reverend Thompson was in the small library where they had first met. Samuel had taken a big risk by accusing some of the most powerful women in Richmond. "I came to thank you, sir," Samuel said, "for trusting me and doing something when you could have just ignored me." Thompson stood up and held Samuel's hand tightly. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'm sorry Virginia's laws couldn't give you real justice. Just this half measure of freedom with exile attached. It's more than I could have hoped for. It's more than most slaves will ever see. You gave me something I never thought I would have. What are you going to do in Philadelphia? Get a job, start a life, and try to forget what happened in that Franklin Street house?" Thompson nodded slowly. "I hope you can forget. But I also hope that one day, when slavery is finally over, people will remember what you went through, not to get back at you, but to understand how completely this system corrupted everyone it touched." On October 3rd, Samuel left Richmond with his wife and mother in a hired wagon. They got to Philadelphia 11 days later, with almost no money and no friends in the city. But Samuel was a good carpenter, and he got a job within a week. He rented a small house in an area where a lot of free black people lived, and slowly but surely, he started to build a new life. He never talked about what happened to him in Richmond in public, but he did write it down in a journal that he kept hidden in his workshop. He wrote down everything. Catherine Harrow's first call, the systematic abuse that followed, the growing horror as he realized other men were going through the same thing, the terrifying choice to talk to Reverend Thompson, the investigation, the legislative session he wasn't allowed to go to, and finally, the freedom papers that had sent him into exile. Isaac moved to New York and made his home in the growing black community in Lower Manhattan. He did talk about what happened to him, but he never used his real name or named the women involved, unlike Samuel. He joined the fight to end slavery by going to meetings and sometimes testifying about what it was really like to be a slave. His stories of being taken advantage of by his mistress were strong evidence for abolitionists who said that slavery hurt everyone, regardless of race. Isaac spoke to a group of almost 200 people at an anti-slavery meeting in 1853. "They say that slavery is a civilizing institution," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard across the crowded hall. "They say it helps both the master and the slave, that it brings Christianity and order to a lower race. But I can tell you from my own experience that slavery is nothing but corruption. It corrupts the enslaved by taking away their freedom and dignity, and it corrupts the enslaver by giving them complete control over other people. Absolute power, without checks or balances, without accountability or restraint, and that power will be abused. It can't be any other way. Some of the other men went to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, or even Canada, while others went to other places in the North. Some people tried to forget about Richmond by getting jobs, starting families, and living normal lives. Others couldn't get away from the memories and lived haunted lives, broken by what had happened to them. Even though the government was quiet about the scandal, it still had an effect on Churchill society back in Richmond. The 8 families whose women had been exiled were cut off from social life. They were invited to fewer events and were not allowed to join committees and boards where they had once been important members. Some families left Richmond completely and moved to other cities where their names didn't have as much baggage. The enslaved people who had seen the scandal but not testified were stuck in a strange limbo. They knew what had happened and had seen things that went against every rule of the society they lived in, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. The knowledge sat inside them like poison, and it made Richmond's black community understand that the white families they served could be very hypocritical. Rachel, who used to be Margaret Wickham's nurse, decided to stay in Richmond even though she was free now. She was too old and tired to start over in a new place at 73. She and her daughter lived in a small house in Shockoe Bottom, and they only had the little money that Margaret had been able to give her before she left Virginia. In her last years, Rachel would sometimes sit on her porch at night and look up at Church Hill, where the mansions were, where she had spent her life serving people who said they were better than others but did terrible things. She never talked about what she saw in public, but she made sure her daughter and granddaughters knew the truth. "Don't ever let them tell you they're better than us," she would say. "Don't ever think that having white skin or a nice house makes you a good person. I've seen what they really are when no one is watching." She died in 1860, just a few months before the Civil War would begin to tear apart the society she had known. Her grave in Richmond's African American cemetery had a simple stone with her name and dates on it, but it didn't say anything about the part she played in revealing Churchill's darkest secret. The Virginia State Archives kept the official records of the event sealed, just as the legislature had ordered. The vault that held them was opened for routine maintenance every now and then, but the papers inside were never touched. The archivists who took care of the collection didn't know what was in the sealed files. They just knew that they couldn't be opened until 1924. Richmond society dealt with the scandal as best it could, making up a story that protected reputations but hid the truth. The official story said that 8 women from well-known families had been involved in financial crimes and had gone into hiding to avoid being charged with embezzlement. People believed this version because they heard it so many times. They would rather believe a story about white-collar crime than the truth about what really happened. But the truth has a way of getting out, even when it's not supposed to. The real story spread in the kitchens, laundry rooms, and living areas of enslaved people. People told it in whispers, passed it down from generation to generation, changed it, and added to it until it became almost like a myth. Some stories said that 20 women were involved, while others said that the women had been doing some kind of witchcraft or devil worship. But at the heart of each version was the same basic truth. The most respectable women in Richmond had used their male slaves in ways that went against every rule of Southern civilization.